What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the show today. We've got a very good conversation with Congressman Rob Whittman. Congressman Rob Whittman is a fisherman. He's been all over the place. He's fished both commercially and recreationally. He's done a tremendous amount of work in the Chesapeake Bay as he is a congressman for the state of Virginia. And he reached out to me on the text line, 305-930-7346. That's where you can also reach out. And he told me about a bill that he's sponsoring about shark depredation. Depredation means that you are catching a fish and it gets eaten by a shark. It's happening all over the place, whether you're in Texas, Louisiana, all the way down the state of Florida, all the way up the state of Florida, all the way to Maine. People are talking about sharks just eating everything that they're catching. When we go over to the Bahamas, sharks are eating everything that we're catching. You stop for 5 seconds and you catch a yellowfin tuna and sharks on it immediately. There are a lot of sharks, and it has been a topic that is on a lot of fishermen's minds, and this bill is going to be of interest to you. I ask a lot of questions about what exactly does that mean to fishermen. Are you going to try to keep us out of certain areas? Are we going to lose access to certain areas? What are the steps that would be taken to control the shark population? And we go over all of that in this conversation. So stay tuned for a very informative conversation with Congressman Rob Whittman of Virginia.
I'm Rob Whittman, represent the 1st Congressional District of Virginia, and this is the Tom Rowland Podcast.
So, Congressman Rob Whittman, hot seat, 1 minute. Here we go. Inshore or offshore?
Offshore.
Rock, country, or other?
Rock.
Mountains or beaches?
Beaches.
Sunrise or sunset?
Sunrise.
Text or calls?
Text.
One thing you're afraid of?
Not being able to fish as often as I like.
Winter Olympics or Summer Olympics?
Summer Olympics.
Fiction or nonfiction?
Nonfiction.
Audio, paper, or Kindle?
Audio.
The last book you remember reading?
Neptune's
Throws-
Inferno.
Okay, good. Office, Friends, or Parks and Rec?
Parks and Rec.
Which technological gadget do you rely on the most in your daily life?
My cell phone.
Let's see. Something you're proud of?
Getting through some legislation to preserve and conserve the Chesapeake Bay.
Okay, name a movie that always makes you laugh.
Oh gosh. Wow.
Well, that's a good one. You actually made it quite a bit further than most people.
Wow.
Along
Yeah,
that's
that's a good one. I would say, what's the one with Chevy Chase, the Holiday Vacation or whatever?
Oh yeah. How do you beat that?
Yeah,
The original National Lampoon's Vacation.
That's
then
it.
you also
National
have
Lampoon's Vacation.
you have some other ones. Vegas Vacation, Christmas Vacation, all
That's
of those.
right.
They're all great. I love the whole thing.
Yeah.
So, Congressman, thank you for reaching out and coming on the show today. And you have some interesting news that you wanted to talk about. You're sponsoring a bill, and I'd like to talk about that bill and what actually it is.
Sure. Well, I'm sponsoring legislation, and the bill's called the Shark Act, Tom, and what we're dealing with shark populations. Listen, there's a great side of the story. Shark populations are recovering significantly. And listen, I think you all have done an incredible job about portraying that, whether it's Saltwater Experience or whether it's Into the Blue. You see shark depredation. You see sharks at Marathon Lump eating blackfin tunas. And you know that sometimes you just got to leave to get out of there. You all do a great job of the Bahia Honda fishery there with tarpon in showing what happens there with these hammerheads. In fact, you've shown, too, how incredible animals these are, and actually going to catch one and said, hey, this is one of the biggest fish they ever caught in your lifetime. So we see that. I mean, I've had the opportunity to travel to Florida and love catching tarpon, but also I'm a little disappointed when one gets eaten by either bull sharks or hammerheads. And then off the coast, like the North Carolinas, where they rely on a charter fleet to be able to catch yellowfin tunas. Now, it used to be you'd hook 15 tunas and you'd lose one or two to sharks. You didn't mind doing that, but today, in many days, Tom, you hook 10 and lose 10, and it's a tremendous waste of the resource. And it's also something that is going to affect the survival of the charter industry, both inshore and offshore. We're seeing these sharks now eat bottom fish, eat red snapper. And for the first time ever, Tom, I've seen sharks starting to eat big, we call them red drum or redfish. It used to be the redfish and the sharks kind of lived together. You'd catch some sharks and you catch some redfish, and you'd never see sharks eat the redfish. Now we're seeing them eat these big 40 and 50 pound reds, which is pretty disturbing to me. So hearing and seeing all that, I looked at it and said, shark depredation, as the term is used, is becoming a big issue. And I talked to a number of people across the spectrum, from folks like Guy Harvey and his foundation to the American Sport Fishing Association, to the National Marine Manufacturers Association, to the Teddy Roosevelt Conservation Trust. Across the spectrum, everyone says we have to address this problem. And listen, this is not about killing sharks. This is about figuring out, how do we, as sport fishermen, as recreational fishermen, how do we coexist with sharks? How do we get to keep some of our catch? Listen, I understand sharks, we're living in their environment. I understand folks say, well, it's, sharks just being sharks. But the question is how can we do this in a way that looks at shark populations in a sustainable way? How can we make sure, too, the recreational fishermen get to enjoy what they do? And my bill puts together a panel of experts to say, let's talk about this. Let's bring everybody to the table and figure out, how do we go about this? National Marine Fisheries Service says, oh, don't worry about it. We got it. We've talked about it. But let me tell you, shark depredation is off the scale. So if National Marine Fisheries Service is addressing this issue, then they haven't been successful in really putting out solutions for that. So that's where we are today. We want to have that conversation. Again, I want to emphasize, this is about making sure we have sustainable shark populations. But we've seen, from interactions with human beings in beaches, with shark bites and shark attacks, to pictures of massive schools of black-tip sharks. I mean, all those things are occurring before our eyes. National Marine Fisheries Service ought to be proud of the model of success for restoration of shark populations, but now they have to be willing to take the next step. What do we do in managing all of our species? And Magnuson-Stevens Act requires we manage all of them, not just some, but all of those species.
Interesting. And so you're 100% correct in my opinion. My opinion, in my experience, is that the shark depredation is the highest I've ever seen in my lifetime. And everywhere we go, from Louisiana down to Key West, up to, when we cross over to the Bahamas and fish over there, it's all over the place. Mm-hmm. And I was trying to tell some people that aren't really fishermen about that. They were like, well, but it seems like sharks are on the decline. They're about to go extinct. I'm like, well, I don't know about global numbers, but I can tell you that is not the case in Florida, the Gulf of Mexico, over to the Bahamas. And it seems like it is very possible that maybe worldwide numbers could be going down, but other numbers are going way up, right, at the same time. So I think that's what we may be dealing with there. But how do you see, as you start to have this conversation, how do you see, what do you see as possible solutions?
Well, listen, I've talked to a lot of fishermen, and, there are certain technologies out there that claim to be capable of repelling sharks, of deterring sharks. And from the people that I've talked to that have used those, they've been used with limited success. So I think we have to look, is there technology out there that can dissuade sharks? Are there things that we can do also to kind of move sharks out of an area? I don't know if that's even possible, but I think it ought to be one of the things that we talk about. Another thing that we need to address is that, we see behavior of sharks changing. I think two things are happening, Tom. One is shark populations, anecdotally, I think, are growing. So the first thing we need to do is let's do a proper stock assessment. Let's figure out exactly where the populations are today, because the older stock assessments are very old. And remember, too, as we talked about restoring shark populations, they're live bearers. And everybody says, oh, long gestation times, it takes a long time for them to recover. But remember, live bearers are different than free spawners, where that broadcast eggs and sperm, and you hope that they fertilize, and you have millions of these things, and plankton eaters eat them, and you maybe have a handful survive. Remember, these live bearers, when these little sharks hit the water, they have a high degree of survivability. So their mortality is much lower than egg spawners. So I think what we're seeing is a incredible success story. So the question is how do we get a real handle on where shark populations are today? Anecdotally, as you've said, observationally from fishermen, I think we all know shark populations are at an all-time high. Anecdotally, let's do a stock assessment to really put some scientific numbers behind it. And then secondly, let's figure out not only shark populations, but let's figure out too, are there certain things that are happening in areas that are sort of the dinner bell for sharks? I would argue, when a charter fishery goes to a certain area where we know the tunas are, and sharks all of a sudden hone in on whatever it is, the sound of the engines there, as boats slow down to troll the things, or when a boat stops to reel a fish in. Are there little triggers there? And is there something that we can do that counters that signal, sort of the dinner bell that goes to shark? I think there may be technologies out there that can do that. Or even things too that, as you've said on some of your programs too, you've seen lemon sharks targeting bonefish. Are there things we could do in shallow water to maybe, send a signal at something that repels sharks? Some of those technologies I think are there. They really haven't been refined yet. Some would argue that they have been, but I want to look at technologies to do that. Also, and some folks says, Rob, all you want to do is kill sharks. I don't. But what I want to make sure we look at is there is a very limited fishery for sharks. I want to figure out, is there a way that we can, look at that fishery? Can we properly now manage shark populations just like we manage every other species of finfish? Listen, the family of sharks, chondrichthyes, is a very diverse family. We want to look at, are there different things that instigate certain shark behaviors? I think a lot of this remains to be discovered. I do think that there's a solution there, but it's not one single point. But we got to understand where shark populations are now, and then really look at, what are the things that are essentially pushing this sort of shark behavior, and what are things we can do to counter that.
So, do you see any possibility that something like this in this bill would infringe upon fishing rights in the future? Like people would not be able to fish in certain areas where there are high degrees of shark depredation? Because I know that's where a lot of the anglers and the people listening to this podcast are like, well, I'm all about, doing something about the shark problem, but not if it infringes upon my fishing rights.
Tom, I couldn't agree more. This is not what this is about. It's not about killing sharks. It's not about pushing fishermen out of certain areas and saying, hey, the sharks get to have these areas. Just like as we talk about marine sanctuaries, I get concerned about those things too, because marine sanctuaries many times are where the fish live. And they said, well, you can fish the rest of the ocean, but, listen, 90% of the fish live in 10% of the ocean. We don't want to get pushed out of the 10% of the ocean. That's not the issue or the intent with this bill. I want to make sure that this is a situation where we can coexist, where shark populations can remain healthy. In no way, shape, or form should this be a situation where we say it's one or the other. And that's why the makeup of the group of people that would come together in this represents all the different aspects of it. And that's why we've gotten buy-in from all of the sport fishing groups out there that have said, hey, shark depredation is a problem. And they will be at the table, and I know they'll be very vocal to say, listen, pushing recreational fishermen out of certain areas where we have these shark intersections is not the way to go about doing this. So that would not even be on the table. And I can tell you the folks that would be part of this group that provides the input, I can guarantee would be very vocal to say, no, that is not an option that's on the table.
That's good to hear. What about would you have an invitation to a commercial interest, commercial fishermen at the table? Would they have a say?
and Tom, I think they would have to. The commercial fishermen have, a lot of observational things that they can add. And listen, these sharks are having an impact on the commercial fisheries too. What I want to make sure it doesn't become, and I think it'll be pretty clear, is listen, there's not going to be a predominance or a majority of commercial fishermen here, but I do think that you have to have them in the conversation, because I do think that wherever the science ends up in shark populations, and we do allow shark harvest right now, the question is going to be, what part of a proper management program would that be? And I
Mm-hmm.
think you have to have commercial fishermen at the table to say, well, here's what we're dealing with sharks. It should not be the predominance there, and it won't be. But I do think that you have to listen to their perspective.
Well, they also might have possible solutions about if there was a shark harvest, how much could they conceivably harvest if
Yes.
they were allowed to fish certain areas, and would that be enough to you know do something about this problem that we're all seeing? And maybe, we're kind of dancing around it, like, well, we could use technology and different things, but maybe it is to a point to where you have to open season on the sharks in a responsible way, just like you monitor and open seasons on every other thing, from a deer, when you have deer overpopulation, to what we're looking at with possibly increasing bag limits on red snapper,
Yeah.
all kinds of things like that. And it seems like that would be something that would be considered, is the possible commercial fishing of sharks, or just harvest recreationally of sharks.
Well, Tom, that certainly has to be within the realm. And remember, National Marine Fisheries Service under Magnuson-Stevens Act is required to look at that part of how they manage these species. I think, though, you have to make sure you take a step back, because we have old data on these shark populations.
Mm-hmm.
So let's get the most up-to-date data. So the first thing I think we need to do is a stock assessment. Let's have a very rigorous stock assessment, especially on large coastal sharks. What we're seeing is, great hammerheads, duskies, lemons, black tips, and we even see off the East Coast. It's amazing to me. When I grew up, we used to catch a bunch of sandbars, and if you caught a 30 or 40 pound sandbar, it was a big fish. We're seeing 150, 175, sometimes even
Wow.
200-pound sandbars now eating these tuna. So, something's going on there. This is a very healthy population of sharks. So let's do the stock assessments. And I think that then can inform fisheries managers to say, okay, then what role would a sustainable harvest play in those populations? And again, I want to emphasize, because I don't want folks to go, this is about killing sharks. It's not. It's about how do we manage this. And National Marine Fisheries Service is charged with doing this. And remember, we're right on the heels of Shark Week. Everybody loves to watch those programs, about sharks and what's happening there. Amazing, amazing animals. But I think what they need to understand too is that, like anything else, there's a balance in nature, and we want to make sure that we maintain that balance. And human beings are part of this ecosystem, so we have to be part of that management element. And you can't just push us out. And your question earlier about, well, are you just going to push, recreational fishermen out? No, I mean, we are part of the ecosystem. And by the way, the law requires that they consider recreational and commercial interests in how they manage these species. So the law, the law
What law
dictates.
is that you're
Yeah, that's
you're
the
referring to?
Magnuson-Stevens
Okay.
Act. Magnuson-Stevens.
Very cool.
Magnuson-Stevens says very clearly you will manage the species based on both recreational and commercial interests.
Very interesting. And then the data that you're referring to is old data, the stock assessment. Why do we? It seems like there's been a tremendous amount of science on sharks, and there's a lot of interest in sharks. Why are we operating on old data? Have we not been taking stock assessments over the last 10, 15 years?
Well, we haven't done any recently. A lot of the studies on sharks, are tagging studies. On a great example is great whites. You tag a great white, you see where it goes up and down the East Coast. But remember, those are individual sharks, so you're tracking those, and on the East Coast now there's a ban on taking short fin makos, and they looked at it and said, hey, we think short fin makos are on the decline. That was a determination, though, that was made by the international bodies, the International Commission on Tunas, ICAT. And they said, hey, and they manage all pelagics, including things like swordfish, and marlin, and other species, tunas. And they said, listen, short fin makos are overfished, but they looked at it in a macro sense. So that shark species has already been limited because of the stock assessments that they have. Again, it's data from across a much wider sector. What normally has happened, Tom, is that we have engaged commercial fishermen, normally longliners, to go out and catch sharks in the areas that they live, and from that use that survey data to do a profile. How many sharks did they catch per unit effort? And that tells you roughly how many sharks are there. What's their age group? How many are spawners? How many are young sharks? What are the fecundity of those sharks? Fecundity is essentially how many young can they produce, and that gives you the total sense of biomass. How many total pounds of sharks are there per unit area, and then spawning biomass. How many of those are spawning age females? How many males there too that are compatible spawning age males? And that gives you an idea about where the population is going. We don't have any of that information recently on these sharks. In fact, if you look at publications, if you pull out a National Geographic magazine from several years ago about sharks, their little chart shows all sharks are endangered except great hammerheads. The thing is if you look at their references, all the stock assessments are old. So let's do some stock assessments that reflect where we are today. And listen, to do that, you have to engage fishermen. You have to be able to engage both commercial and recreational fishermen and engage them in a study and say, we want you to go out and catch some sharks, not to kill them, but to gather data on them. And some of them you will take out because you want to be able to gather data from the cartilage in a shark, which tells you the age. So you will have to kill some of them to gather data, but some you will not. So I think it's incredibly important to do that. That is the first step to inform us on how do we manage these populations.
And what would be the steps necessary to start that process like that? Can the individual constituents be part of that process? Do you need to vote on it? How does that get started?
Sure. Well, it's National Marine Fisheries Service is charged under Magnuson-Stevens Act to do these stock assessments. So they're directed to do that. What we want to make sure is that they are using all aspects of data. In fact, I have language in that's actually now in the law that requires National Marine Fisheries Service not only to gather their own data from their structured studies, but to also engage recreational fishermen to get anecdotal data. In fact, I would argue if you gather that observational data from recreational fishermen, it is as valuable as the data that you gather from these catches of sharks, where you categorize the sharks, how old, which ones are spawners, those sorts of things. So we want them to do both. We want their study designs to be informed by folks that are observationally seeing what's happening with sharks. A great example is Gulf red snapper. When they were doing those stock assessments, they'd pull a trawl net over open bottom. And they were saying, well, there's no red snapper around. Well, that's pretty obvious because Gulf red snapper are reef fish. So if you don't try to gather samples around bottom structure, you're not going to catch anything. So that's why Garrett Graves, who's the member from Louisiana, and others, and myself included, said, hey, let's have an independent group besides National Marine Fisheries Service actually go out and do the stock assessment, because National Marine Fisheries Service wouldn't change the structure of their study to actually go find fish where the fish live. Because anecdotally, you go to these places and these places are chock full of Gulf red snapper. You drop a camber to the bottom and they're all over the place. And you're like, how can they come up with this conclusion that there are no Gulf red snapper? So what we want to make sure too is that these studies are structured the right way. Let's go fish for these sharks where we are seeing them, where we know they live, where we know they are targeting where their meals are coming from, instead of saying, well, we're going to fish in some area where traditionally there are no sharks there, and you go, well, the longline didn't have anything, therefore therefore shark populations are not recovered. So I think it's key to structure the studies the right way, and the most important thing is to integrate observational data from fishermen, both recreational and commercial fishermen. If you do that, then I think you'll get a true scientific indication of the populations.
How long do you think that process would take if done properly?
Well, Tom, what I'm hoping is that our bill, it got a hearing before the subcommittee a week ago yesterday. And I'm hoping it'll get before the full committee. I'm hoping it'll pass out, go to the floor on the House side, pass, and then we'd like to see it either taken up by the Senate or have a companion Senate bill. I would hope that it would get passed and signed into law by the end of the year. That would be the impetus for the National Marine Fisheries Service to put this working group together, and from there, start on the track of designing how stock assessments would be done for all of these different classes of sharks. I think they need to start with the large coastal class of sharks. And listen, if they did that and did it expeditiously, I think that they could track that study to start, the middle to the end of next year, which I think would give us good data. It usually takes by the time they compile the data, get all the data in, it usually takes about a year after that to finally have a conclusion about where shark populations are. So I would say best case scenario, probably maybe a 2-year period of time to a point where you'd have the data to say, let's make some decisions about managing shark populations.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the large coastal sharks. What species would that be?
Yeah, large coastals are the hammerheads, so scalloped, smooth, greater hammerheads, dusky sharks, sandbars, black tips, the ones that live in those coastal areas. So pelagics are great whites, poor beagles, salmon sharks, makos. So they put them into different categories. So the large coastals, lemons are part of the large coastal shark population too. So the ones that we normally come in contact with. So you're inshore and you're in your offshore fishery. Most of the ones you come in contact there, most of the ones that are predominantly eating these fish are the large coastal class of sharks.
Mm-hmm. So is there any way that interested fishermen can follow along with this process or be involved in it outside of the state of Virginia where you are? Or is there anything that we could do?
Absolutely, Tom. I would encourage folks to track the bill. They can go to the Natural Resources Committee website. So the U.S. House of Representatives Natural Resources Committee will have information on this bill, what's happening with it through the committee. There's also a conduit there for folks to comment. And listen, they can go to not only to our website, which is Whittman, WITTMAN.house.gov, but I would urge folks across the country to go to their member of Congress, because their member of Congress will have a role in this when this bill comes to the floor. So go to their member of Congress and say, hey, take a look at the Shark Act. Ask them to sign on as a co-sponsor. Ask them to track it. Ask them to support it when it gets to the floor in the House to be voted on. Ask their U.S. Senator to support it over on the Senate side. Listen, if they have ideas about the bill, we don't claim that this is the perfect mechanism. So if people have thoughts and ideas, send them our way or send them to your member of Congress. We want to make this bill as good as it can be. So when it gets to the full committee to be marked up, we probably will make a few changes to it just to make sure that we get it in the form where it can gain the most support. And the best ideas don't come from inside Washington. They come from folks that live this each and every day. So.
What kind of resistance do you see with a bill like this or this particular bill?
Well, listen, we've tried to reach out to all the environmental groups, and folks like the Teddy Roosevelt Conservation Trust are really, I think, a very forward-looking conservation group. Listen, we know we'll get some pushback from conservation groups that'll say this is a bill about killing sharks, and shark populations are not recovered, therefore we shouldn't even be talking about this. I want to make sure that we're using science to make these decisions.
Right. That's where that stock assessment comes in.
Yeah. So what I would say to these folks is let's gather the science. We shouldn't be afraid of gathering the science, and then that ought to drive management decisions. And the law says this is how we're supposed to do it. So we just want to follow the law.
Very interesting. Well, I mean, I think that most people that fish anywhere between, I don't know, Maine and Key West on that side and Key West to Texas on the other side have seen that there are way too many sharks and don't really know what to do about it.
That's
so really, I think it's refreshing that someone in your position is interested in this and does feel as though it's out of balance and is offering some solutions. So congratulations for that. Really think that you have, or you seem to have the fisherman's best interest.
Yeah.
And that is because you are a fisherman, right?
Yes.
Like you sent me some pictures of your office. It looked pretty awesome. We don't see anything behind you right now, but let me tell you, man, this guy has mounts all over his office, pictures of all these fish that you caught. It was a very impressive looking office. I liked it. Is that the same place that you are right now?
Well, actually, I'm back. Oh, that's my Washington office. I'm actually back in the congressional district now. So this is my office over out just outside of Richmond in Henrico County. So I don't have as many of those critters here, but I am blessed to have had some great experiences fishing. And listen, I grew up working as a mate on a charter boat, both in the Carolinas and the Chesapeake Bay. Worked on the
Nice.
commercial fishing side too, so I've seen that element of life. Worked on a scalloper, worked on a longliner, so I really had great experiences on the water. So it's great, and that is what that's what fuels my passion for making sure we're properly managing our fish populations. Because I look at it from both standpoints. We have a very robust recreational fishery in Virginia with the Chesapeake Bay, with coastal Virginia, with the Outer Banks. And I am very connected with those folks, as well as folks in the commercial fishing industry who rely on a healthy marine resource to make a living. So I always tell folks I get somewhat disappointed when recreational fishermen are after commercial fishermen and vice versa. I really think our purpose needs to be, how do we increase fish populations in general? And when we do, then we can kind of debate who gets to catch which portion of them. But when we see fish populations declining, that's what ought to be to join everybody together that's interested in fish to begin with. So that's always been my focus. And I'm blessed, the district I represent, Tom, has one of the largest shoreline areas of any district in the United States, from the Chesapeake Bay and upwards in our rivers. So it's really about the interest of folks in the district, and they are constantly in my ear about the things that we need to do to properly manage these resources. So that's what drives my interest.
That's great. I couldn't agree more on banding together and avoiding pointing the finger at each other and seeing this group of fishermen, both commercial and recreational, in all the different nuances. My feeling has always been that we have to come together. We're strong together.
Yes.
We're weak apart. And there are lots of different reasons and issues and other things that maybe they try to purposefully divide us, or just that's the way it is. Like, it's all the commercial guy's fault. Well, it's all the recreational guy's fault. I don't see that as productive at all to preserving fishing and fisheries as a whole. So I love to hear that you feel the same, and it's hard sometimes. That is a really hard thing to do, is not to point the finger at the other guy, whether it's a fly fisherman pointing the finger at a bait fisherman or a recreational fisherman pointing the finger at commercial guys, but it does nothing but weaken us as
That's
fishermen.
right. Well, Tom, we need to grow the pie, and you've got some great groups out there. Captains for Clean Water down the Everglades doing an incredible job there, really pointing out to say, hey, water quality means something, and it means something for everybody. So if we can come together and say, let's grow the pie, and then we can debate who gets to catch what portion of the pie. But if all we're doing is fighting over a shrinking pie, then shame on us.
Right. And I also think that the one group that you mentioned, I have a strong connection with them. And the reason that I like Captains for Clean Water is because they come with solutions.
Yes.
They come with solutions, and they're saying, look, all we really need is to raise awareness. The solutions already exist.
Yes.
And that's kind of where I was kind of going with this bill, is like, it's interesting that there's something out there at all, that people are at all interested, but what's the solution? What is, if this bill were to pass, what have you already thought about that? And we've already gone through that for 30 minutes about what those solutions are. But I can support anything that has logical, reasonable solutions that we can move forward, both as commercial and recreational anglers. I think that's super important.
It is.
So the one other thing I was going to ask you is about your fishing experience. So you grew up. Oh no, I'm sorry. We talked about that, but when I was reading through your website, it said that you had done a tremendous amount of work on Chesapeake Bay. Let's get a health check on Chesapeake Bay, because I know I have a lot of listeners up that way for the cobia, for the striped bass, everything up there. It's a tremendous fishery, and I know so many people up there listen to this podcast. So what could you give us a health check on Chesapeake Bay and where we are right now and what's going on up there?
Sure. Well, listen, there are certain indicators of the bay are doing better. Crab populations this year in growing, oyster populations. What a great success story in the restoration of oysters there in the Chesapeake Bay. Clams too, great clam aquaculture business, and we're seeing some things happen in the bay that give me hope. As you said, striped bass populations. Listen, they need to get better, but I see certain things that anecdotally make me believe that they're recovering. Cobia population is great story. I think we have to really look carefully about how we manage cobia, because I don't want it to turn into something where we have, large numbers of small fish. I think there needs to be a trophy element of that too, where you have a chance of catching a fish over 50 pounds. I think those things are incredibly important. Another thing too we're seeing, Tom, that we haven't seen, and when I worked on a charter boat back when I was a very young man back in my 20s, the bay was full of giant bluefish, literally bluefish from 15 to 20 pounds. And interestingly enough, I just talked to my son today. He lives in the upper part of the bay, and he's been going over on the other side of Tangier Island, and he said there's a big bluefish over there, these 10 and 15 pound bluefish that they're catching on top water and swimming plugs, and great fun. So we see a little bit of that, a little bit of recovery of that fishery, and we know bluefish have kind of gone through cycles, so we see a little bit of that in the bay. Incredible Spanish mackerel fishing in the bay, so certain elements of that. The one thing though that does concern me about the bay is the bay through years has had a very healthy population from the top to the bottom, from the pelagic area, which is the top water column, all the way down to the benthos, which is the bottom. So croaker and spot and those species. And we go through cycles with very robust croaker populations, and we see a little bit of recovery in spot, but there are certain areas in the bay that used to have live bottom that don't have it anymore. And those are these anoxic zones that happen during the summertime. And we've seen some of that happen in the Gulf too. So we still have a ways to go to improve water quality, but there are little indicators of the Chesapeake Bay. And the interesting thing about natural systems, Tom, is that natural systems don't respond linearly. So in other words, if water quality gets bad, it resists and resists and resists, but then when it can't resist anymore, it drops off. So it's kind of like a stepwise progression rather than a straight line. But it also recovers that same way. So if you take pressure off of a water body, Mother Nature is pretty resilient. It recovers too in that stepwise progression. So it can take a big step up as well as the step down if you have degrading water quality. So I think there are some things that are moving in the right direction. Listen, we're challenged in the Bay watershed. We've gone in the last 20 years from 16 million in population to 18 million in population. So we still have to do more in what we call non-point source pollution, the stuff that runs off the land when it rains. The sewage treatment plants, the point source efforts have done well, but we still have a ways to go with non-point. But I would say overall, if you look at the rating of the bay, I would say that there are elements of success there, but still a ways to go.
Okay. Well, I like where, anything is on the rebound, and that's good. And there have been some really big success stories up there, and we're experiencing some big success stories in South Florida. So it's good to stay involved and to stay informed about what's going on, especially with this shark bill. So I really appreciate you reaching out and offering to share this with us and our audience here, and really thank you for what you're doing and having the back of the recreational and the commercial fishermen. That means a lot, because a lot of times it doesn't seem like we have any representation, and other times it comes out of the woodwork, and you do see who is supporting the recreational fishing. But I know that you are, and I really appreciate that.
Well, Tom, thank you. Very passionate about it. Listen, thank you. Thanks for your podcast. Really informative. And thanks, too, with what your production company does. Incredible programming. I love it. I'm addicted to it. I think you all do an incredible job there.
Thank you.
Some of your new programs that are coming out too, just incredible. So you really have the ability to pick out fishermen that have the passion for fishing, have the professional background. So thank you for doing that. Just keep doing more of it, man. I love it. So
Thank you. Well, we'd love to have you back on the podcast in the future to see what's going on with this bill and any other news or issues that we could talk about or bring light to. So we'll stay in touch, and I'd love to have you back.
Absolutely, Tom. We'll come back. We got another bill in. Maybe we'll talk about another time about protecting access for Hunters and Anglers Act, which is, really about their effort now to ban lead. And listen, if there's an issue in an area where science shows lead's having an impact, I don't have a problem with that. But carte blanche ban, really, I think is problematic. But anyway, that's something we can talk about another time. But
Sure,
another
I'd love to.
element
That'd be
that I'm very
great.
passionate about. Yeah.
Me too. Me too. I'm passionate about fishing and hunting access. I don't like to
Yes.
see that get taken away at all, because my experience shows that when it has been taken away in areas that I am familiar with, we never get it back. We've never
You're
gotten
exactly
it back.
right.
And
It's death by a thousand cuts. We can't let it go because it's almost impossible to claw it back.
Right, right. So I am far on the side of preserving access at all costs, and dealing with any sort of problems. I mean, there's lots of ways to skin a cat, right? You can
Yes.
you can ban access, or you can do lots of other things. So anyway, well, thank you for your time today. I know that you're very busy, and I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. I look forward to doing it again.
Sounds great, Tom. Look forward to coming back with you. And thanks again. Thanks for all you do.
Thank you. All right, bye.
Bye now.
All right, that was a great conversation. Thank you to the Congressman for coming on the podcast, and also appreciate him walking us through this bill and letting us know just what it is. He also suggested that you talk to your own congressman. If you're not in the state of Virginia, talk to your own congressman about it. And, this is something that's out there. It's something that is coming. So I think that it's best to be aware of it. And if you agree with it, awesome. If you don't agree with it, awesome. You can make your voice be heard. And he gave us opportunities to do that. So thank you to the congressman, and watch for this bill. Here it comes. All right. That's it for this week. We'll see you next week. See you.